Hello everyone, this is Dr. Setka. In this short video lesson, I'm going to walk you through the process of developing a strong thesis statement. The first step in developing a strong thesis statement is understanding what kind of essay you're writing. All of the essays you'll be composing in this class will be literary analysis essays. Literary analysis essays are argumentative essays that are written for the purpose of showing readers your interpretation of a literary text in a convincing way. So, what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement is a brief statement of your essay's main argument or interpretation. In this class, you'll find that because you're developing a longer essay than the typical 5-paragraph essay you were taught in high school, your thesis statement will correspondingly be longer as well, generally about 2 to 3 sentences. You want to avoid simply listing the main ideas of your supporting paragraphs. Again, that's the model that many of you were probably taught in high school when you learned to develop a 5-paragraph essay, where you have your argument and then you have a list of those 3 primary supporting points. That doesn't work in college level essays, and the reason is quite simple. You are writing longer, more complex arguments that will typically require more than 3 supporting paragraphs. So I want you to unlearn that model if that's what you were taught prior to this class. The other thing that you should keep in mind is that your thesis statement should be a kind of opinion based on observable fact about the literary work. However, I want to caution you that the use of the word opinion here is an academic or intellectual opinion. It's not the kind of opinion that's based on feelings or beliefs. You're developing arguments that are based on evidence and logic. So I'm going to give you some examples of thesis statements as a way of illustrating the qualities of a strong thesis statement. So first and foremost, a literary thesis statement should be debatable. It shouldn't simply be a statement of fact about the text. It has to kind of introduce something that a reader could potentially argue with. So our first example comes from an essay about William Shakespeare's play, Hamlet. While most people reading Hamlet think that he is the tragic hero, Ophelia is the real hero of the play, as demonstrated through her critique of Elsinore's court through the language of flowers. Now here, the writer is challenging a common view of the play Hamlet, which is that the title character, Hamlet, is the hero. This author is suggesting, no, as a matter of fact, Ophelia is the real hero, and here is why. A next characteristic of a strong thesis statement is that it should always be rooted in observations about literary devices, genres, or forms. For example, Hawthorne's use of symbolism in the Scarlet Letter falters and ultimately breaks down with the introduction of the character Pearl, which shows the perceived danger of female sexuality in a puritanical society. In this class, we're focusing primarily on American Gothic literature, so you will often find yourself reverting to a discussion of Gothic characteristics or features as part of your thesis sentence. And finally, a thesis statement should be specific. Here we have an example from Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Through its contrasting river and shore scenes, Twain's Huckleberry Finn suggests that to find the true expression of American ideals, one must leave civilized society and go back to nature. So here we have a very kind of focused example. The author is already kind of directing us to the context of his or her argument. This is particularly important when you're writing about longer works like novels or films that have multiple scenes, multiple characters, and multiple areas of conflict, right? So you want to, especially when dealing with a longer text, kind of rein it in to focus our attention on one specific aspect of that work. Okay, so here is a list of what your literary thesis statement should not be. It should not be confused with the purpose statement. So sometimes I'll see essays that use an example like this one as a thesis statement. In this essay, I am going to analyze The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Well, that's great. You've told us what the essay is going to do, but you haven't told us what you plan to argue. So this would not be considered a debatable or well-developed thesis statement. A thesis statement should not be more about society than the work of literature. So you want to avoid broad generalizations. For example, gender roles are bad and should be abolished. Well, this may be a valid opinion, but your goal with your thesis statement is to keep your readers' attention on the work or works of literature that you're analyzing. So broad statements like this will not serve you well. Next, a thesis statement should not be a summary or obvious statement about the text. So, for example, A Rose for Emily is about a woman who kills her lover. That's a statement of fact. That's not a debatable observation, right? So any information about the plot or an obvious statement about characters or setting, that's not going to work because it's not an argumentative statement. Your thesis statement should not be a judgment about the quality of the work. So for example, Psycho is a really powerful film. I happen to agree with that statement. However, you are not a film reviewer, you're not a literary critic. Your job is not to say whether a text is good or bad. Rather, your job is to tell us what a text is doing, how it's doing it, and why that matters. And finally, a literary thesis statement should not be about the author rather than the literature. So for example, Edgar Allan Poe and Washington Irving were both creepy towards women in their personal lives, but in different ways. That's a valid observation, but your job is not to be a historian or a biographer. Your job is to analyze literary texts. So again, you want to keep the focus on the work or works of literature that you're analyzing in your essay. So to help you out, I've developed what I call the thesis statement formula. Now I'm going to start out by saying that one of the reasons that writing is so challenging for many students is that unlike math and science, we don't really operate with formula. Writing is part art and part rules, right? If you think about grammar and rules of organization and all of that stuff, but there is an element of artistry. So I'm giving you this formula as kind of a set of training wheels, if you will, to help you through the process of developing a thesis statement. But as you develop in terms of your facility with writing and as you gain more confidence, you can feel free to kind of deviate from this model. Okay, so that's my caveat emptor. I'll get into the formula. So a thesis statement equals observation plus interpretation plus relevance. So beginning with observation, this is simply what do you notice? Right? And what you notice is typically going to be guided by the kinds of questions I'm asking in the prompt. So here we have an example. The Telltale Heart features a mentally unstable first-person narrator who insists he is sane. Okay, this is a valid observation, but it's a statement of fact, right? This is a good starting point, but it cannot be your stopping point. So now we move from observation to interpretation. Interpretation is, what does your observation mean? How can you explain it further so that your reader understands its value or what it means, right? So building on our first example, in The Telltale Heart, the obvious instability of the first-person narrator who repeatedly insists on his ability to think and act in a rational way, creates an atmosphere of psychological horror that unsettles the reader. Now you'll see that I've played with the phrasing of the first observation. This is an example of how writing is always an ongoing process, and that your writing should evolve with each draft, right? The text in blue indicates the addition of the interpretation, right? So I'm explaining what it does to have this unstable first-person narrator. And finally, we have relevance. So relevance is your explanation of why your observation and interpretation matter. In The Telltale Heart, the obvious instability of the first-person narrator, who repeatedly insists on his ability to think and act in a rational way, creates an atmosphere of psychological horror that unsettles the reader. What is perhaps most horrifying about the story is not simply the fact that the narrator commits a brutal murder, but also the fact that he believes his perceptions of reality are accurate. In this way, Poe shows us that the most frightening threat is the potential unreliability of one's own mind. Right, so here we're moving from a discrete observation about the text into a broader statement of its meaning and value, and finally an explanation of why the observation and the interpretation matter. In your essays, you're always going to want to keep two questions in mind, whether you're developing your thesis statement, analyzing supporting quotations, or even, wrapping up the essay with your conclusion. Those two questions are, so what and who cares, right? You're always going to want to make sure that you are convincing your reader of your own interpretation. Your reader doesn't live in your head, so what you take as a given fact may not in fact be shared by the person reading your essay. So you always have to be thorough and careful in your explanations of the text and what it's doing. Okay, I hope this was helpful. I'll see you in the next lecture.